Hi, good morning, everyone. It is time to start political parties. This will be the next part of our unit. It's 11 slides here, and I'm going to try to do it in one shot, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. At least I'm going to talk quickly. All right, so what is a political party? We do need to have our very quick and easy definition. Excuse me, a group that seeks to elect candidates to public office. Very, very simple definition. There are three parts to that. It's an organization which recruits candidates for office. If you're going to run candidates to get elected, sorry about that head cough. So if you're going to elect candidates for public office, first thing you got to do is recruit candidates for office. Then you act. The other part is you act. We talked about this in the last unit, or the last part of this unit, about voters. It's a label is assigned for voters. That person is a Democrat. That person's a Republican. I know in general what those parties stand for, so I can have a choice. And then it creates a set of leaders to organize and control the legislative and executive branches. That's what they do when they're in office. So we're going to start today talking about just sort of some of the things that they do. And also remember the last thing, that it is one of our four linkage institutions, which we'll be talking about. We already talked about one, voting, or so elections are. So we'll deal with elections again in a little bit, actually. So elections, political parties, interest groups, and the media. And so they're all in this unit that we'll be talking about. So getting candidates elected to office. So what do? Part one, they recruit, right? Their candidates obviously are crucial to winning elections. You have to recruit good candidates, and they spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to find good candidates. And the national parties and the national party organizations, the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee, are very much involved. This is where they spend a lot of their time and a lot of their money, is to find, recruit, and train candidates. Because candidates need to be trained. You just can't take some Joe off the street and say, hey, you can run. There's training involved in how to campaign and how to do all the variety of things that they do. Then you have to nominate candidates. So most states have primaries. You need to know these three types of primaries. Okay, most states have them. Some states have caucuses. So we'll talk about those when we talk about elections. There's closed primary. That means only registered party members can participate. Only if you are a registered Republican can you vote in the Republican primary. Registered Democrat, vote in the Democratic primary. Those states tend to have very strong political parties. A lot of those are in the Northeast and the industrial Midwest. Then there's the open primaries. Georgia is an open primary state. What that means is that you can go, when you go into your precinct to vote, you choose on the primary day, I'm going to vote in the Republican primary or I'm going to vote in the Democratic primary, and then you get that particular ballot. So you can walk, there's no such, you don't need registration, you don't need anything. Anybody can vote in any of the primaries, but only one primary. You can't vote in both. This way, one of the things you need to understand about one of the differences between open and closed primaries is an open primary state a more moderate candidate can emerge, because remember, if you are a member of a political party, so it's considered a closed party state here, the people who take the time and the effort to be registered as members of political parties are the most partisan of each party, the partisan of the Democrats or the partisans of the Republicans. And they're going to vote for a more partisan candidate, whereas in an open primary state, there's a possibility of a more moderate one because they're not openly big partisans. There's more than just those that are voting. You have to know that, and you have to know why. And then there's what we call a jungle primary, or top two. This is one thing that Louisiana does this. It's the only state off the top of my head that does this. All the candidates are on one ballot, and the top two, they could be of the same party, run in the general election. We had a version of this, actually. It wasn't a primary, but if you remember back in the November election for the Senate seat that Johnny Isakson resigned from, so Kelly Loeffler held that seat, the actual election on November 6th was in this jungle form. And the top two candidates, whoever they were going to run off then when we had our January 6th or January 5th, runoff. And those two top vote getters were Loeffler and Warnock. So that's how that works. So we actually saw a version of that in Georgia, but that is a rare thing to see in Georgia. All right, helping candidates win. They provide a party label. That party label is necessary, D or R. The 90% of party voters vote for their party's candidate, so that's very important. They do these things called get out the vote efforts, GOTV. That's a lot of times in the news and the media, you will see that abbreviated that way. Those are efforts to get their voters to the polls. They call them, they text them. That I got at least 4 texts on election day because the people who knew me and knew my voting record knew that I had yet to vote. I didn't do early voting. I always vote on election day, and I always vote at the end of the day because I'm working and I vote on the way home. And so I got at least 4 texts, if I remember correctly, on election day saying, "Hey, you got to get out and vote. You got to get out and vote. You got to get out and vote," because they knew I hadn't voted yet. So that works. And the technology today is amazing, and what they do with the information that they have, they can also do phone calls, they do visits, they do texts, like I just said. They organize transportation. If you can't get to the polls, we'll send a van to bring you to the polls. That kind of thing. A lot of money, a lot of time and effort is spent on this. We'll visit people, they'll talk to people, they'll ring doorbells. It's all about getting your people out to vote. They also provide candidate services for resources. Candidates need resources. They need lists of supporters. The National Party has those. The people that were texting me knew me, and that's sort of the National Party idea, that they have conglomerate all that information, or at least the party in Georgia conglomerates all that information, and they can get that out to the candidates. And they do polling, and they provide them with staff, and they provide them with other things. And they, of course, provide them with money. And money is a big deal. Parties in the electorate, a little bit of functions of the party in the electorate. Voters' partisanship is generally stable. So they know that. The people that contact me, pretty sure they know how I'm going to vote. And they're right. They know how I'm going to vote. But what changes things? Or first of all, what sets those, right? We talked about this in the last unit with political socialization. Parents and political environment when coming of age. That sort of sets your partisanship, whichever side you might be on. And then things can change. I'm just going to give you 2 examples of events. Some generally reliable Republican voters moved to being more of a Democratic voter, or voting for Democrats anyway, during the 1990s because of the economy that was surging. So they voted for their pocketbooks, essentially, and that's what happened. So Bill Clinton was the president. He got a lot more votes in 96 than he got in 92, partially because of this factor. And then 9/11, of course, to give you an example there. There were more Republicans, so more people, perhaps the Democrats, that started to float over to the Republican side due to the perception that Republicans were more competent than Democrats on national security. So events can change things, at least for sort of the middle. It's not going to change things for the partisans very much, but maybe those moderate are where that can change. Let's go quickly to history, very fast. The Republicans, they were actually called that, then they called themselves the Democratic Republicans. So this is not the Republicans that are now, the Republicans that started with Lincoln. So make sure you keep that separate. Thomas Jefferson was the big one. Federalists was led by Alexander Hamilton, interestingly, not the president or somebody looking to be the president. And it really was just a small group of political notables. That's what they were back in those days. Just a few people. It's the Jeffersons, the Hamiltons, it's the Adams, it's the whoever's, right? Republicans defeated the Federalists in 1800, the first big changeover, right? And then, actually, if you did not know, during the War of 1812 and leading up to it, and then for sure during the War of 1812, the Federalists, which were generally concentrated in the Northeast, so the New England states, planned to secede. They actually had plans. They had a convention scheduled. They were ready to secede from the Union until Andrew Jackson's forces beat the British in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. Then they just looked silly because the war was essentially won. And so they looked silly for trying to secede, and they actually died out. They disappeared. By 1820, boom, no more Federalists, mainly because of that last thing. Hey, we're going to secede, and then we win, and they go, oh, well, we suck. Then we get to what's called the second party system. That's a Jacksonian system. After Jackson was seemingly, and it looked like that if you remember from U.S. history, called the corrupt bargain, seemingly with some shenanigans in the House, because the election went to the House. He lost to John Quincy Adams, but then his popularity surged. And then, so when we get to the Jacksonians, starting really in 1828, participation increases dramatically, and increases in a big way. It becomes bottom up, not top down. Everything had been top down before. This is now where regular or more normal, regular, everyday people start to participate. We get party conventions to nominate presidential candidates instead of just the few higher ups getting together and going, okay, this guy's going to be our candidate. We start to get the convention system. We start to get the primary system. Lots of regular people start to get involved. Then post-Civil War, this is where slavery and sectionalism started to change things. The modern Republican Party started as a third party, and it's the only third party ever to achieve major party status. They first ran their presidential candidate in 1856, and then, of course, in 1860, their candidate won, Abraham Lincoln, right? Democrats will end up as the party of slavery. And in general, for the rest of the century, the country was fairly evenly divided. Republicans and Democrats. If you remember that from U.S. history, that period was called the Gilded Age as we get to the end of the century. And really, there was not much difference between a Democratic president and a Republican president. There wasn't a whole lot of difference between Chester A. Arthur and Grover Cleveland, and all the way until McKinley when things started to change again. The North was generally Republican, and the South was generally Democrat. And the parties are going to weaken. The progressive era, the first part of the 20th century, the parties will weaken. And then we're going to get what we call realignments. We have to talk about these. You have to understand what are called critical or realignment elections or periods. And that is, so we have to define it before we get to it, a period when a major party, or when there's major lasting shifts occurring in the popular coalition supporting one or both parties. When things change, okay? Then there's several different periods we have to talk about. First, 1800. That was the first big change, the first time with peaceful transfer of power and all that. When the Democratic Republicans defeated the Federalists. Big change. Then we get the Jacksonian Democrats coming to power in 1828. And essentially the Democrats, with just a little bit of exception of a Whig candidate here or there winning, they controlled everything. In 1860, though the Whigs collapsed, the Republicans subsumed the Northern Whigs, plus a bunch of other little parties, the Free Soil Party and a variety of other anti-slavery groups. The Republicans will come to power then in the 1860s. That's the current Republican Party. 1896, Republicans defeated the Democratic populist candidate William Jennings Bryan. If you remember from U.S. history, he ran for president 4 different times and never won. And then we get to 1932. The Democrats come to power under FDR. Now, the next slide is going to talk about a couple of things that we need to understand about the really critical realignments that we're going to talk about. And that's going to be the last slide. So there's two types of realignment. One type is when a major party is defeated and a new party emerges. That only happened twice. 1800, Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. So the Democratic Republicans replaced the Federalists. The other one was in 1860 when the Republicans. A major party is defeated. The Democrats, a new party emerges. The Republicans were a third party, now become a major party. The other way is when the parties continue. They're still the same names, Republicans and Democrats, but voters shift their support from one to the other. Those two things happened. Those happened in 1896. And then in 1932, massive changes, of course, in 1932. And that's the last of the realignment elections we've had. There have been changes, but there's been no realigning election. In 1932 through 1936, many of the people who were Republicans became Democrats. Some of the people who were Democrats became Republicans, and their ideas changed too. The Democrats became the party of government intervention in the economy and things like that, and the Republicans had been that, and the Republicans became the party of less government intervention in the economy and things like that, and smaller government versus bigger government, and massive change. The changes are more gradual now. And then there's this last concept called de-alignment, and that is the idea that people are de-aligning themselves from parties. Now that's possibly happening now. We might be in a period of de-alignment. Because more and more people say they're independent. You do the Gallup poll that they do all the time. Are you Democratic, Republican, or independent? The number of people calling themselves independent is on the rise, which means the number of people calling themselves Democrats or Republicans is on the downswing. And that may be happening now. So we might be in a period of what we call de-alignment. Okay, so that's it for this part. You'll have an assignment. Next time around, we will finish political parties, and there'll be another assignment, and then we'll move along. The first quiz is going to be the week after this, and it'll be later in the week, next week, and it'll be on parties, it'll be on voting, and it'll be on what we just did, voting, parties, and interest groups that are coming up. All right, I'll see you then.